Now we will discuss microsocial factors. Microsocial factors refer to social elements in the immediate context. The immediate context are the contexts which include your home, school, universities, offices, business offices. So these are the immediate contexts. And these microsocial factors are the elements which are there in the immediate social context. Now, they are concerned with language acquisition and use in the immediate social context in terms of production, which is producing a language or using a language, interpretation, that how the members of that social context interpret or understand that language use, and then the interaction purposes, that how the language is used for interaction purposes. Microsocial contexts include level of formality. Sometimes it is considered that formality is pretty less in the immediate social context. So microsocial contexts have the level of formality in terms of if the discussion interaction is being taking place among the friends or teacher and students, boss and subordinates. So the type of level the members enjoy in terms of the expression with regard to formality. Participants' relationship to one another. So what type of relationship the participants have with one another. Then the nature of interaction. Is it private interaction, conversation, or it's public? The framework of accommodation theory and variation theory serve as the basis of the microsocial factors. So this takes us to have an understanding of the accommodation theory. So let's see what the accommodation theory is. Accommodation theory is also known as communication accommodation theory. It was developed in 1971 by Howard Giles, a professor of communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Communication accommodation theory is also known as CAT, which is communication accommodation theory, and it is basically theoretical perspective that examines the underlying motivation and consequences of what happens when two speakers shift their communication style. So basically, it examines the motivation, that why people, or what happens when two speakers shift their communication style, and they shift their communication style to accommodate each other. This theory argues that during communication, people will try to accommodate or adjust their style of speaking. So this is important, and that's why it is called that communication which is based on accommodation. Now, idea is to see that when people are engaged in a process of communication, how they accommodate or adjust their style of speaking to facilitate the communication process. This is done in two ways: divergence and convergence. Divergence means showing differences between ourselves and other individuals based upon differences in social groups. Now, these differences refer to divergence. And convergence means adapting our communication to emphasize similarities in the terms of speech, gestures, and topics, etc. So all the divergence and convergence factors basically are there to support the accommodation theory. Now, the accommodation theory has this diagram where you can see that it relies on, first of all, here if you see how our language converges or diverges with others. Then you have, at the bottom, you have speech, vocal patterns. Vocal patterns are basically your accent, your pronunciations, and your gestures. So in communication, all these three factors contribute. And then at the second level, you see divergence and convergence. And here, complete human interaction. So accommodation theory is a communication theory for the interaction purposes, takes into account speech, vocal patterns, gestures, and how the languages is convergence and divergence is being used for the communication purposes. Then we have variation theory. According to Martin's theory of variation, discernment of critical features, distinguishing of critical features, occurs when systematic interaction takes place between a learner and the thing that is to be learned. And variation is the agent that generates such interaction. So variation needs to be understood in terms of second language acquisition and also how the second language acquisition process takes place in a learning setting. Here, the variation requires distinguishing of the critical features of interaction, and based on this distinction we see that theory has proposed 4 patterns. First is contrast, second is separation, generalization, and fusion. Looking at contrast, it means the ability to seek distinguishing of the different aspect of the critical features, something which is different, the features how they are different, unlike things. Separation is basically having the or separating the awareness of critical features from the rest. Generalization is a variation interaction which is inductive in nature. Fusion is basically integrating the critical features to form a whole, or integrating the critical features in the whole of the process or the whole of the pattern. So the variation theory basically works on or is established on the fact that one has the ability and one should exercise that ability to assess the variation that takes place in the interaction. This is again, as we see that in the accommodation theory, we also see that learners accommodate their learning styles or their speaking styles to accommodate each other. Here the variation needs to be understood in order to have a very facilitating and encouraging environment in terms of developing any learning process. Now we have the microsocial factors, which are based on the framework provided by the accommodation theory and the variation theory. Now the microsocial factors are 3. They are second language variation, input and interaction, and third is interaction as the basic genesis of a language. Now, under the second language variation, you see that second language variation happens during the process of language acquisition. It is also considered that second language variation occurs when language learners and native speakers use different linguistic forms. Second language production variety is acquired due to social network a learner may have. The social networks are the networks in which different varieties are used. So the learner's social network basically determines the kind of variety he or she acquires in the second language acquisition. Then we have input and interaction. Language input is essential for language acquisition. Native speakers use simple talk when interacting with second language learner, with little beneficial input because of important omission. So basically, the importance of omission in terms of what needs to be omitted has been taken care of under the input and interaction factor. On the other hand, linguistic simplification modifications may be helpful for language comprehension. So it encourages simplification process and modification process of a language because this can enable or provide the comprehension process or create the comprehension process much more easier task. Discourse simplification may be of greater benefits for a second language learner as well as repetition to confirm the comprehension. So this this course simplification, the understanding, the analyzing of the production may be of great benefit for second language because it provides the verification of the comprehension that a second language learner goes through. The third social factor is interaction as the basic genesis of language. The core of any language is the interaction. Language acquisition partly takes place through interaction. Second language learners are dependent people who need assistance, interpersonal interaction from the language expert in order to achieve the higher language competence and produce language without any help. So here you have Vygotsky's zonal proximal development, where the second learner is dependent on the interpersonal interaction or the need or assistance to develop the language proficiency. Another type of interaction refers to communication that takes place within yourself, that is intrapersonal, within yourself. And second language learners interact with themselves when they try to comprehend what they read and hear by making translations or their content schemata. So basically, intrapersonal interaction is when the learner is trying to understand something by questioning himself or herself or speaking to himself or herself in terms of translating the content he or she hears or listens to, and also simplification that he or she does in his or her mind through intrapersonal interaction. To conclude, the accommodation theory and variation theory provide the framework for micro-social factors in second language acquisition, which involve second language variation, input and interaction, and interaction as basic genesis of language.